Have you ever wondered what darkness lurks behind the most ordinary eyes? What secret turmoil boils beneath a placid surface, just waiting for the right moment to erupt? We often imagine monsters as easily identifiable figures, their malice etched onto their faces. But the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see coming, the ones who wear the convincing masks of normalcy, of friendship, of love. This is the story of such a monster, a man so average, so unremarkable that his eventual descent into brutal violence left an entire community reeling, asking a question that still haunts them today. How could we have not known? In the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Maple Creek, where manicured lawns and friendly neighborhood barbecues were the norm, Arthur Blackwood was the epitome of the common man. A librarian by profession, he was a creature of habit and routine. His life was a meticulously cataloged collection of predictable moments. The morning paper, the brisk walk to the library, the quiet evenings spent with a book and a cup of tea. He was a man who blended into the background, a face in the crowd you would instantly forget. His colleagues described him as quiet, diligent, and perhaps a little shy, but never once did a word like dangerous enter their minds. Arthur's world was small and carefully curated. He lived in the same modest house he had grown up in, a time capsule of faded floral wallpaper and polished wood furniture. He had few friends, preferring the company of the literary figures who lined the shelves of his workplace. To his neighbors, he was the polite if distant man who always offered a gentle nod and a faint smile. They saw a life of quiet contentment, of peaceful solitude. They saw a man utterly incapable of the chaos and savagery that was to come. They were tragically, horrifyingly wrong. The morning of October 12th began like any other in Maple Creek. The air was crisp with the scent of autumn, and the gentle rhythm of suburban life was undisturbed. But inside the quaint little house at the end of Oak Street, a storm was brewing. A pressure that had been building for years, unseen and unheard by the outside world, was about to reach its breaking point. The delicate facade of Arthur Blackwood's ordinary life was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces, revealing the terrifying emptiness that lay beneath. The first hint of the horror to come was a phone call. A frantic, breathless voice on the other end of the line, pleading for help. It was Martha Higgins, Arthur's next-door neighbor, her words tumbling out in a torrent of panic. She had heard screams. She told the dispatcher terrible, gut-wrenching screams, followed by a sudden, deafening silence. It was a silence that felt more menacing than the screams themselves, a heavy, unnatural void that spoke of something deeply, irrevocably wrong. Police were dispatched, their sirens a jarring intrusion into the morning's tranquility. When the officers arrived at the Blackwood residence, they were met with a scene of eerie stillness. The house, usually so neat and orderly, was in disarray. A window was shattered, its jagged edges glinting in the morning sun. The front door was slightly ajar, an unspoken invitation into the heart of the unfolding nightmare. A sense of dread hung heavy in the air, a palpable premonition of the horrors that awaited them inside. They drew their weapons, their hearts pounding in their chests, and cautiously pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness. What they found inside would forever be seared into their memories. The once immaculate living room was a scene of utter devastation. Furniture was overturned, lamps were shattered, and dark, viscous stains marred the pale green carpet. In the center of the room lay the bodies of two people, a man and a woman, their lives brutally extinguished. They were later identified as Thomas and Eleanor Vance, a well-respected couple from the community, known for their philanthropic work and their kind, generous spirits. The question of what they were doing in Arthur Blackwood's house was just the first of many that would plague investigators. But the horror did not end there. In the kitchen, they found another victim, a young man in his early 20s, his life cut tragically short. And in the upstairs bedroom, the final and most gruesome discovery of all, Arthur Blackwood's own elderly mother, her frail body bearing the marks of a savage, unthinkable act of violence. The sheer brutality of the scene was staggering, the work of a mind completely unhinged. There was no sign of the mild-mannered librarian, only the bloody aftermath of his terrifying transformation. Arthur Blackwood, the quiet man next door, had vanished. The town of Maple Creek was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire, a dark cloud of fear and suspicion descending upon the once peaceful community. People who had known Arthur for years struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming librarian with the monstrous killer he had apparently become. They searched their memories for any sign, any clue that might have foretold the coming storm, but found nothing. He had been a ghost in their midst, his true nature hidden behind a veil of perfect, terrifying normalcy. The investigation began immediately, a frantic race against time to find the missing librarian before he could strike again. The crime scene was a chaotic puzzle of conflicting clues. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting that the victims had known their killer, that they had willingly entered the house of horrors. Robbery was ruled out as a motive. Valuables were left untouched, their monetary worth insignificant in the face of the killer's insatiable rage. The only thing that seemed to have been taken was Arthur Blackwood's own car, a nondescript gray sedan, now the subject of an all-points bulletin. Detective Miles Corrigan, a seasoned veteran of the force, was assigned to lead the investigation. He had seen his fair share of darkness in his long career, but the Blackwood case was different. There was a chilling intimacy to the violence, a personal fury that left him deeply unsettled. This was not the work of a professional hitman or a common thug. This was the work of someone who had snapped, someone whose mind had fractured under an immense, invisible pressure. Corrigan knew that to catch this killer, he would have to understand the man behind the monster. The search for Arthur Blackwood became a national manhunt. His face, once so anonymous, was now plastered across every television screen and newspaper in the country. The public was captivated by the story of the librarian who had become a killer, a real-life doctor. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Sightings were reported from all corners of the country, each one a dead end that only added to the growing frustration of the investigators. It was as if Arthur had simply vanished into thin air, a phantom leaving a trail of bloodshed in his wake. As the days turned into weeks, Corrigan and his team delved deeper into Arthur's life, peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed world. They interviewed his colleagues at the library, who spoke of a man who was meticulous and organized to a fault, a man who found comfort in the rigid structure of the Dewey Decimal System. They spoke of his quiet nature, his reluctance to engage in personal conversations, his almost complete lack of a social life. He was a man who lived in the margins, a footnote in the lives of those around him. They spoke to the few people who could be considered his friends, a small circle of fellow book lovers who met once a month to discuss classic literature. They described him as intelligent and well-read, but also strangely detached, as if he were observing life from a distance rather than actively participating in it. They recalled his occasional flashes of frustration, his moments of quiet, simmering anger when the conversation strayed from the familiar territory of books and into the messy, unpredictable realm of human relationships. But none of them had ever seen him as a threat. The investigation into the victims' lives provided another piece of the puzzle. The Vances, it turned out, were not just casual acquaintances of Arthur's mother. They were her financial advisors, the people she had entrusted with her life savings. And the young man found in the kitchen was their son, a recent college graduate who had just started working at his parents' firm. A picture began to emerge of a financial dispute, of a simmering resentment that had finally boiled over into unimaginable violence. Corrigan's team uncovered a series of letters from Arthur to the Vances, each one more desperate and angry than the last. He accused them of mishandling his mother's finances, of taking advantage of her trust. He wrote of his growing fear and desperation, of his feeling of being trapped and powerless. The letters were a chilling chronicle of a mind on the edge, a man slowly losing his grip on reality. The mild-mannered librarian was a facade, a carefully constructed mask to hide the rage that festered beneath. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A sharp-eyed gas station attendant in a small town, hundreds of miles from Maple Creek, recognized Arthur from a news report. He had seen the quiet, unassuming man just a few hours earlier, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted. He had filled up his gray sedan and paid in cash, his hands trembling slightly as he counted out the bills. He had said nothing, his silence more unnerving than any words could have been. The attendant's tip sent a wave of excitement through the investigation team. They had a lead, a direction, a tangible clue in a case that had been defined by its frustrating lack of evidence. They were closing in on him. The net was tightening. The phantom was about to be unmasked. Corrigan and his team raced to the small town, a sense of grim determination in their hearts. They were going to bring Arthur Blackwood to justice, and they were going to find out what had pushed him over the edge. They found Arthur's car abandoned on a dusty side road, its doors unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. It was as if he had simply walked away, leaving his old life behind. A search of the vehicle yielded a single, chilling clue, a well-worn copy of Dante's Inferno, its pages filled with Arthur's own cryptic annotations. The margins were filled with his spidery handwriting, a rambling, incoherent commentary on the nature of sin and punishment. It was a glimpse into the mind that had become its own private hell. The manhunt intensified, the search now focused on the dense, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded the small town. For days they combed the woods, their dogs barking at every shadow, their helicopters circling overhead. The media descended on the town, their cameras and microphones eager to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. The story of the killer librarian had become a national obsession, a dark and twisted fairy tale for the modern age. It was a local hunter who finally found him. He stumbled upon a makeshift campsite deep in the heart of the forest, a small, pathetic shelter built from branches and leaves. And there, huddled by a dying fire, was Arthur Blackwood. He was gaunt and disheveled, a shadow of his former self. He offered no resistance, his eyes empty and devoid of any emotion. The monster had been captured, but the mystery of his transformation was far from over. The trial of Arthur Blackwood was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had committed such unspeakable acts. He sat in the defendant's chair, a small, insignificant figure in an ill-fitting suit, his face a mask of blank indifference. He seemed to be a million miles away, lost in the labyrinth of his own broken mind. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer, a man who had planned the murders with meticulous precision. They presented the letters as evidence of his premeditated rage, his growing obsession with the Vances. They argued that he had snapped not out of a sudden, uncontrollable impulse, but out of a long simmering resentment, a deep-seated feeling of being wronged by the world. The defense, on the other hand, argued for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. They brought in a team of psychiatrists who testified to Arthur's fragile mental state, his long history of social anxiety and depression. They spoke of a man who had lived his life in a state of quiet desperation, a man who had finally been pushed over the edge by a series of unfortunate events. They portrayed him as a victim of his own mind, a man who was not responsible for his actions. The trial became a battle of psychiatric experts, a complex and often contradictory debate about the nature of sanity and madness. The jury was left to grapple with a difficult and unsettling question. Was Arthur Blackwood a monster, or was he a man who had been turned into a monster by a world he could no longer comprehend? The line between good and evil, they were beginning to realize, was not always as clear as they had once believed. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. They found Arthur Blackwood guilty of all charges, but with a recommendation for psychiatric treatment. He was sentenced to life in a secure mental institution, a place where he would be both punished for his crimes and treated for the illness that had driven him to commit them. The trial was over, but the questions it had raised would linger long after the courtroom had emptied. In the aftermath of the verdict, the town of Maple Creek struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The sense of safety and security that had once defined their community had been shattered. They looked at their neighbors with a new sense of unease, wondering what secrets, what darkness, might be hidden behind their friendly smiles and polite greetings. The Blackwood case had taught them a terrifying lesson, that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones you least expect. The house on Oak Street remained empty for years, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. It became a local legend, a place where teenagers would dare each other to spend the night, a source of morbid fascination for a town that was still trying to heal. The story of Arthur Blackwood became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the terrible consequences of a life lived in quiet desperation. Years later, a young journalist decided to revisit the case, to try and understand the man behind the headlines. She spent months poring over the court records, the psychiatric reports, the letters Arthur had written. She even managed to secure a rare interview with the man himself, now a gray and stooped figure in the sterile environment of the mental institution. What she found was not a monster, but a man consumed by regret and confusion. He spoke of his life with a sense of detachment, as if he were describing the plot of a novel he had once read. He could not explain what had happened on that terrible day, why he had done the things he had done. It was as if another person had taken over his body, a dark and violent stranger who had then disappeared, leaving him to face the devastating consequences. He spoke of his love for his mother, of his growing fear that she was being taken advantage of. He spoke of his frustration with advances, of his feeling of being ignored and dismissed. He spoke of the pressure building inside him, a pressure he did not know how to release. He was a man who had been screaming for help in a language that no one around him could understand. The journalist's article was a powerful and moving piece of writing, a nuanced and compassionate portrait of a man who had been reduced to a one-dimensional caricature by the media. It did not excuse his actions, but it did offer a glimpse into the complex and often tragic circumstances that can lead a seemingly normal person to snap. It was a reminder that the line between sanity and madness is often much thinner than we would like to believe. The legacy of the Blackwood case is a complex and unsettling one. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of empathy and understanding, of reaching out to those who are struggling in silence. It is a story that asks us to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in even the most monstrous of figures. And so, we are left with the same question that haunted the town of Maple Creek all those years ago. What makes a seemingly normal person snap? Is it a sudden, inexplicable break from reality? Or is it a slow, gradual descent into madness? Is it the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain? Or is it the product of a lifetime of quiet desperation and unfulfilled dreams? Perhaps the most terrifying answer is that there is no single, simple explanation. Perhaps the potential for such darkness lies within all of us, a dormant volcano waiting for the right combination of pressure and circumstance to erupt.